All right, it looks like we're live. So, Eric, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Just to jump right in, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there are any reasons to believe in a God. Could you tell me some of the reasons you do believe for belief in a God? Then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. A few things I'd say is just first make a differentiation between uh, reasons perhaps one comes to believe or reasons that should justify reasons to believe in God. I think reasons that would justify belief in God would be things like the argument from contingency, the kalam, the moral argument, argument from evil. And then there are also arguments that I would use against atheism, which I would take to be the belief that God does not exist, and that would be like the evolutionary argument against nationalism that Evan Plantinga came up with, closely tied to the argument from reason, the existence of consciousness, free will, the existence of the soul, and the resurrection. And for our discussion, I mean, we can take it anywhere you want, but um, knowing that you've done some of these with other people, my interests were going to be particularly more in arguments, like I said, against atheism, which I would take as a belief that there is no God, and then focusing on things like consciousness, free will, and the soul.
Okay, we can definitely do that. Just to be a little more clear by what I mean is that if for belief in God to be reasonable, there has to be a reason that justifies belief in God. So if there is no reason that justifies belief in God, then belief in God is unreasonable. So if you believe there is a reason to believe in God, like free will, for example, my position is that free will is logically impossible, kind of like a square circle. So I don't know what free will could possibly be. Do you believe that God cannot do logically impossible things, right? He can't create a round square or two plus or universe where 2 + 2 = 5. Would you agree to that?
Yes, and I can't help but ask because you say you don't believe in free will. If you really came to believe that,
No, I did not freely come to
uh,
believe that. I was determined to believe that.
why should I believe what you're determined to believe?
Why would my determining make it more or less true? It's
Right. Yeah.
irrelevant. Like if I'm determined to believe that 2 + 2 = 4, the fact that I'm determined to believe it doesn't make it any more or less true.
Right, but it gives you no justification for believing it's true.
No, the fact that I'm determined to believe it makes it independent from my justification. Justification doesn't come from the fact that I'm determined to believe it. Those are two
Right,
separate things.
but it undercuts your justification.
No, it has two separate things. They're unrelated in every way.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing that they're unrelated, but I'm saying the fact that you're determined to believe something undercuts your reason for believing it. Rather,
No,
undercuts
no,
your rationality for believing it.
no, that's incorrect. The rationality to believe something is independent of whether or not you're determined to believe something.
Right, but the fact that you're determined to believe it undercuts the rationality of it. It would be like for example, let's say I get a magic 8 ball, and I ask whether or not it's going to rain, and it says yes. My reason for believing it's going to rain based on the 8 ball is undercut by the fact that it's just a mechanism designed for entertainment, not at conveying truth. So if that's what your brain is and does, and it's determined to believe certain things, then your brain would be like a glorified magic 8 ball.
Well, no, that's demonstrably false. So, like, if I said I believe 2 + 2 = or I'm determined to believe that 2 + 2 = 4 because when I take two objects and two other objects and put them together, I get four objects. I'm determined to believe that because of the reason that I add these together and I get four. So
Well,
I'm still
no,
determined to
it's not
believe it, but the
because of the
justification is still
reason.
there.
Actually, no, it's not because that's not the reason you believe it. You believe it because you're determined, and then you're determined to believe you believe it for those reasons, which is something you're equally determined to believe.
Right? You're determined to believe it because of the reasons. So the reasons exist independent of the determination.
How
So
would you know?
doesn't make
I'm
what
sorry.
you're saying doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't get it.
I agree. It doesn't make sense that there's no free will. So how do you know that you're determined to believe it for those reasons? How do you know that it's those reasons that cause you to believe it? Because if you're determined, it's factors prior to yourself and beyond your control that you're determined to believe it, the determination of irrelevant of what you're determined to think those reasons are for.
What?
Where did I lose you?
So uh, I am a determinist, so I believe there is no free will. Everything is determined, but it's determined by reasons. So if you're going, it's not just arbitrary. It's not random. It's
No, but
like the reason I believe certain things, the reason I'm determined to believe certain things is because those things are justified by reasons, and those reasons compel me, because of how my brain works, to believe that determined thing. So I don't have an option. I can't stop believing that 2 + 2 = 4 because that is determined by the reasons I use to get to that conclusion. So all the things I believe, they are determined because of the reasons that I believe them.
So, okay, right. And I'm asking, how do you know that you're determined for those reasons? Because could it not, let's just hypothetically
Wait,
here.
wait, you said how do I determine I'm determined for those reasons?
How did
Like
you, in other words, how would you know that it is for those reasons? Like those are the reasons, those reasons are what determined you to believe that, as opposed to something else. Because you could believe 2 + 2 = 4 because grapefruits, taste a certain way. That would be a reason that you're determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4. But how do you know it's that specific reason that led you to that belief?
oh, you're right. We could be in the matrix or being deluded by Descartes' demon or something. He's just causing my brain to feel these
No,
things.
that's not what I'm talking about.
But I have epistemic justification in the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, which causes me to believe this.
You're determined to believe you have epistemic justification.
Determined to believe, yes.
Right. So you're just pushing back the goalposts.
No, because it's the same thing. We could be deluded by Descartes' demon, but I don't have any justification to believe that, so it's irrelevant to the question.
Well, I didn't bring up Descartes' demon. You
It's
did.
the same thing. There could be another reason that I believe 2 + 2 =, or there could be another reason I'm determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4, other than the fact of the epistemic justification that I can do the math. But the fact that I can do the math means I have epistemic justification in that reason.
And
So could we be deluded by the Descartes' demon? Absolutely, but we have no reason to believe that. That is an unsupported conclusion. So I mean, I can't be absolutely certain about anything. We could be. There could be other reasons there, but those other reasons, we have no reason to believe them. They have no justification.
Okay, yeah, and that's not my point. What I'm saying is you're determined to believe something irrelevant to the reasons that you're determined to believe that for. So, in other words, chemicals firing in your brain determine you to believe something, and then another set of chemicals perhaps firing in your brain that lead you to be determined to believe that it is those reasons that you're actually determined to believe it. But if determinism's true, and if you're just something physical perhaps, or however you want to hash that out, then it's something prior to you that caused you to believe that.
So yes, I'm just neurons firing. That's correct. And the reasons are a reflection of the neurons firing. So the neurons firing reflect the reasons, which are cause me to determine the resulting belief, which is also neurons firing. So it's like
What do you
we have
mean?
a row of
What do you mean by the
dominoes.
neurons?
What?
And I'm sorry, I cut you off. I think there was a.
So if we have a row of dominoes, and you could say these neurons are the first 5 dominoes, and they constitute the reasons, and then that knocks over the 6th domino, which is the belief. I mean, yes, the 6th belief is determined by the first 5 dominoes. Yes.
Right.
I don't see any.
Yeah.
No
So the
problem.
first domino was not the reasons that you gave. The first domino was something physical.
All the neurons are physical. Those would be the reasons. How the neurons interact in your brain, that's all physical.
Okay, but earlier you mentioned nothing about neurons. You mentioned about when you get 2 things and 2 things that equals 4. That has nothing to do with neurons.
That has everything to do with neurons. That's how your brain processes the information, is through the interactions with the neurons.
Well, I would disagree that your brain processes anything, in the sense that if you're talking about your consciousness is in your brain, but that's an entirely different topic. I don't know if you're understanding my point that, okay, claiming that you have reasons to believe something in spite of being determined that you believe it is something you are equally determined to believe in and of itself. So you're just pushing back the goalposts and pointing to something else that you're determined to believe and claiming that's actually the reason for it. When I'm saying, no, the reason for that is not the reasons you gave. It's simply because your brain was a byproduct of something that led it to believe that, assuming, in your words, that it's your brain that processes and believes these things.
Right, you're confusing metaphysics and epistemology. I'm not making a metaphysical claim. Yes, you are. In fact, you're making the same mistake that Alvin Plantinga did in his argument, his evolutionary argument against naturalism. He confuses methodological and metaphysical naturalism. He mistakes these two things. It's an error. It was brought up, I think, by Michael Roos in his response. But yeah, you're confusing these two categories. My category is purely what I have epistemic justification to believe. There could be more underlying stuff that I don't have access to in the metaphysics, but I don't have access to that. So I can't make any judgments or beliefs based on that information. I can only make judgments and beliefs based on what I have epistemic justification to make beliefs about.
Okay, let me put it this way, because I think we're talking past each other. I don't think you understand what I'm saying. Whatever your justification is something you're equally determined to believe is a justification. Even if that justification is grapefruits taste sweet or sour, that's still a justification that you're determined to believe for a certain conclusion. Or rather, that's what you believe your conclusion leads to. It could be based on anything because you're just determined to believe it.
Yes, it could be. It is logically possible that I'm determined by Descartes' demon interfering with my mind, but there is no epistemic justification for that. Now, I understand exactly what you're saying. I just don't think you've researched the philosophy behind this issue enough. You just don't understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'd say the same about you. So let me try it this way. If someone's determined to believe something because they're determined to believe it's Descartes' demon that determines them to believe it, would they be justified?
If someone believed it because they were determined to believe it by Descartes' demon,
Yeah.
no.
Why is that different from yours?
Because I'm not determined to believe it by Descartes' demon. I'm determined to believe it by the reasons.
Right. No. Look, we'll try
So
to.
I have justification for some beliefs, and then the metaphysical claims you're making are completely irrelevant to the topic. This has been solved in philosophy for a long time. There's no issue here. This isn't even a serious contention in most philosophers. Like, no.
Right. Okay, that's fine. I know you believe that, but let me get to this. So you concede that you're determined to believe X for these reasons. Now, another person could be determined to believe X for a different set of reasons, but y'all are both determined. So it's equal. I mean, there's equal determination going on.
Again, you keep confusing. You just are not understanding the basic philosophy here. The difference between epistemology and metaphysics. The fact that you're determined to believe something is an ontological claim. It is the way it is. But the way it is not the same as how we know things. Those are two different categories of things.
Okay.
How we know things, the justification is independent of the ontology of the fact that we're determined to believe it.
Okay, so you think I don't understand it. I think you don't understand it. So how about instead of accusing each other of not understanding something, just ask me, and then maybe we can get on the same page here. Let's try it this way. Give me rephrase what my argument is. What do you think my argument is? What do you think I'm trying to say?
And I'm not exactly sure, because you seem to be saying that, like, how we're determined seems to make a belief less justified.
Not necessarily how we're determined, but the fact that we are determined undercuts the validity or justification for any belief.
Right, and that's provably false. Like, I can be determined to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. That does not have anything to do whether 2 + 2 = 4 is a justified belief.
Right, I agree with you there.
Determined is irrelevant to the fact of whether or not the beliefs are true. You have to assess those independently.
Yes, and that's an ontological claim you just made. I agree with that, but we're talking epistemology.
No, that was an epistemic claim.
I'm sorry?
That was an epistemic claim. We have to justify that those are independent claims. So I mean, like, you keep trying to get me to explain how the ontology of how I get to the belief is relevant to whether or not you should believe it, whether or not you are justified. Correct?
Say that one more time.
You're trying to say how I'm determined, because the first question you asked was, I'm determined to believe that some belief, like 2 + 2 = 4. And the thing you asked was, then why should I believe you? Right? That was your first question.
My first question was, why should I believe something that you're determined to believe?
Right. So I'm determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4. Why should you believe me? So the fact that I'm determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4 is ontology. Why you should believe me is epistemology. Okay. The justification for the 2 + 2 = 4 is independent of whether or not I'm determined to believe it. The fact that I'm determined is a different question entirely.
Okay. The exact phrase of my question was, why should I believe something you're determined to believe, not just why should I believe you? There's a difference there. So we are talking about okay.
So the fact I'm determined is just irrelevant to the question. The reasons why you should believe it are the justifications independent of whether or not I'm determined. Like, you should believe 2 + 2 = 4 because we can demonstrate 2 + 2 = 4, take two objects. That's why you should believe it. Well, you shouldn't believe it because I'm determined. The fact I'm determined is irrelevant to the question.
Okay. No.
I mean, I don't see where your question is going here.
I can see that. So you're determined to believe something. Let's say I'm not determined to believe that.
Okay.
What's the difference between us?
Well, there's only two possibilities. Either you're determined or it's random. Those are...
No, I'm saying let's concede I'm determined and you're determined. You're determined to believe X. I'm determined to believe Y. What's the difference?
Be the things determining this to be determined.
Right. So our justification for it is both determined. What makes one more or less...
No, the fact that we're determined isn't a justification. You're not determined by the justification.
I'm saying, given the fact that we are determined, where does our justification come from? If not more determined beliefs, which just pushes back the goalpost.
Again, you keep conflating the two. The fact that we're determined is irrelevant from justification. Determination has nothing to do with justification. It's a different topic.
Let me ask you this. Okay, so you're saying the fact that you're determined to believe something has no bearing or weight on whether or not we can justify something or have reasons to justify or have undercutting reasons to not be justified.
Right. I would phrase it and say the justification for a belief is independent of whether or not you come to that belief by some determined process.
Okay. The justification for who? Because when we talk about justification, we're talking about persons.
No, I'm talking about logical justification.
Okay, right. So whether or not something's true is independent of how we justify it. I agree
Right.
there. That's ontology. But the fact that you are
No, that's epistemology.
no, the fact that something's justified the fact that something's true or false independent of us is epistemology.
Yes, epistemology is the study of knowledge and how to justify knowledge.
Mhm.
Ontology is the study of what is and what
Okay. Well,
exists.
let me
So
put it this way
yes,
then.
that's epistemology.
Let me clarify it this way then. Whether or not something's true is independent of whether or not someone has knowledge of it.
Yes.
Okay. Then okay, we're not talking. So in that sense, I can care less about beliefs and knowledge. Something is true or false, even if no one knows it.
Yes.
Okay, good. That's independent of us. Now, what I'm saying is the fact that you are determined, I would say, undercuts any rationality, just like the magic 8 ball kind of thing. If we're both determined to believe something, what reasons could you give if not more beliefs that are equally determined and you're just pushing back the goalposts?
Because determined to believe something is ontology, and whether or not a belief is justified is epistemology. They're two separate categories of things. Like I can be determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4, but that's irrelevant to whether or not there are justifications to believe 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, I think we're beating a dead determined horse here.
So let me start to ask you some questions here. So any decision you make, there are two options. Either you're making the decision for reasons, in which case it's determined by the reasons, or you're making it for no reason, in which case it's random. There's nothing you can add to this to get out of that dichotomy, which means every decision possible is either determined or random. What can you add to that to get free will?
Okay, well, hold on. I want to clarify something you're asking. What do you mean by determined by the reasons? How is something determined by the reasons? Are you saying the reasons are literally the thing that cause?
Yes. So it's kind of like you can imagine a bunch of roads or electrical signals in the brain, where if you get enough of an electrical signal in one direction, it causes you to choose that option or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of your reasons are essentially things that cause the electrical signal to go in that direction.
Right. So all your beliefs you came to after having some deterministic reason. So you don't wake up and believe something without having reasons. Everything you believe, you have deterministic reasons for.
Possibly. I mean, it's definitely no, not necessarily. There are some beliefs you can have without reasons.
Right. So.
But those reasons are usually other things in your brain. Like if I shock you in the correct place, you can have other beliefs that just pop into your head without any other extent reasons.
So could you shock me and determine that I believe 2 + 2 = 4, and then even shock me with the determining reasons for which I believe that, but yet those reasons, let's say you're outside the box and you know those are invalid reasons, yet in my mind you would determine me to believe something and would determine that the reasons you gave me were justifiable.
Right. That's the example I first used, was we could be being deluded by Descartes' demon. But the reasons that you think you have for believing it are independent of whether or not there actually are reasons to believe it.
Yeah,
so your personal subjective, there's like you said, there's truth independent of our beliefs.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have beliefs is irrelevant to whether or not it's actually truly a justified belief. Those are two separate questions. Your subjective reasons, your subjective beliefs don't make it any more or less justified. The question of whether or not it's justified is an objective question, independent of your subjective reasons and independent of whether or not you're subjectively determined.
Okay, I'm gonna hit this horse one more time with this question that I've already asked. So you're determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4 for the reasons you gave. Let's say I'm determined to believe 2 + 2 = 4 because of Descartes' demon. What's the difference in our justification?
Determinism has nothing to do with justification. Determined does not mean justification. Those are separate categories. So the justification there is irrelevant to whether or not we're determined. Our justification would have to be other reasons, other things independent of our determination.
Okay, yeah, but I'm not. Well, no, nothing could be independent of our determination if determinism is true.
No, the fact that we're determined is not itself a justification. You would have to have other things which would be the justification.
I'm not saying your determination is a justification. I'm saying you're determined to believe whatever justification you think is your justification. You're determined to believe something, and then back to, if you shock me, you can determine both my beliefs and you can determine what I think are valid justifications for those beliefs. What would be the difference in my validation or justification for what I believe if even my justifications are something you cause me to believe?
Remember, there's a difference between an objective truth that's true independent of what we believe and a subjective truth. Yes, you are. It's exactly what you're talking about. I don't think you realize it. So our subjective truth of what we think is a justification, like if I'm caused to believe it because Descartes' demon or someone shocks me in my brain, that is independent of whether or not the claim 2 + 2 = 4 has objective justification. It can still have objective justification regardless of whether or not I'm determined. My being determined is irrelevant to the question of whether or not 2 + 2 = 4 is justified.
I know I can agree with you. It can have independent justification, but how? I guess what I'm asking is, but how can you gain access to that if you are determined to believe something? How can you gain access to that justification?
You wouldn't be, the fact that you're determined wouldn't prevent you from gaining access to that justification. So like I could be determined to believe something, but that something could still be true. So the fact that I'm determined doesn't mean it's not justified, or doesn't mean I can't be justified, because you could be determined to believe the justified things, whether you realize it or not.
Sure.
So being determined doesn't make you unjustified.
No, I'm saying it undercuts your reason for having any justification.
Right, and I'm saying that's false, because being determined doesn't make anything you believe unjustified or justified, because you can be determined to believe justified things just like you can be determined to believe unjustified things.
There's a
the fact that
difference.
you're determined doesn't have any bearing on whether or not your beliefs are justified.
Okay, let me put it this way. Let's go back to the magic 8 ball.
We keep asking the same questions over and over again. Let me try to approach it from my way. Can you answer my question?
Well,
every decision you make is either determined by reasons or done for no reason, in which case it's random. Those are the only two possibilities. It's a deductive dichotomy. You got two options. It's determined for reasons, or it's done for no reason and it's random. What can you possibly add to that to get free will? And if you can't, then free will is logically impossible.
No. I would say I choose to believe something based on reasons and the evidence I have before me.
Right, so then it's determined by the reasons and you don't have a choice.
No, I want to say determined because I have a choice here.
Where's the choice? Because if you just choose to believe something and that's determined by the reasons, then it was not a choice, it's determined. So where's the choice?
So okay, well let me first define perhaps what I mean by free will. I mean libertarian free will. And by that I simply mean that I'm the first mover of my will or actions.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to rephrase your question knowing that.
It's same thing. So every decision is done for reasons, in which case it's determined by the reasons and you have no choice, it's determined. Or it's done for no reason, in which case you have no choice because it's random.
And by reason, okay, by determined by the reasons, do you mean causally determined, like a domino?
Yes, yes.
Okay, no, I don't think I'm caused by the reasons, no.
Okay, how do you get out of that dichotomy?
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy.
Okay, well, what's the third option?
It's not an A or not A kind of thing. And
what's the third option?
It's, well, that I choose to based on the reasons I have. I make a conscious decision to. I'm not forced to, in the sense that chemicals in my brain force me to believe something. Now, there are some beliefs that come upon me that I didn't choose to believe, but yeah, there are some things that I do choose to believe based on the evidence.
So everything you said fits into that dichotomy, into the determined part. So
okay, well, I guess
you have like 4 options. Each thing you're going to choose from, and you have like 10 different reasons to pick between these various options, and you choose some reasons and you choose to ignore other reasons. Well, if you choose a reason, there has to be reasons you chose that reason, or there can be no reason you chose that reason, because it is a or not a kind of a thing. It's either there are reasons or there are not reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if there are reasons, it's determined by the reason. If there are not reasons, then it is by definition random. And so the decision is either done for reasons or no reason. And then the choosing of the reasons is either done for reasons or no reason. No matter how far you go down this rabbit hole, you're going to get to the same dichotomy 100% of the time. Mm-hmm. Either there are reasons that determine it, or it is random, and because there are no reasons.
Okay, so you said a lot there. But correct if I'm wrong here, did you not already concede earlier that you can believe things without reasons or having any prior justification or reasons for?
Well, you can believe things because of the reason of your neurological things firing in a certain way. That would constitute a reason.
Neurological firings are reasons?
They would be, yeah, the reason you believe something is because someone shocked you in the brain that caused you to believe it. That could be a reason.
But neurological firings are reasons.
No, it's an awkward way of phrasing it, but essentially that gets to the same point.
Which is?
Everything you do is either determined by reasons. Everything you believe, every decision you make is either determined by reasons or determined by no reasons, in which case it is random. Now, if you want to extend that to a physical description of reality and go with neurons and biological stuff in the brain, then yes, you would consider those to be reasons, because you could make a decision based off of neurological stuff happening in your brain, if you want to include that into the analogy.
Well, I think, earlier you even said everything's neurons when we're talking about beliefs. So I guess on your view, you'd have to include that in the analogy, and you would have to say that reasons are just chemical firings in the brain. So right. If you're asking me if I believe things simply because chemicals fire in my brain, no.
Well, in the analogy I used of saying there are either reasons or no reasons, that applies to everything, including the supernatural, non-physical. If there is a soul kind of thing, it applies to that as well. So I'm using a more general analogy. It applies to all possible realms of reality, which makes it deductive rather than just limiting it to the physical, neurological stuff we know about. So that's why I was using the more general one, not limiting it to neurology.
So I'm happy with saying I choose to believe things without being determined to on my own libertarian free will based on reasons.
Okay, but that didn't answer the question. You're still stuck in the dichotomy, which proves that's logically impossible. Either you determine it's determined by the reasons, or you have no reason, in which case it's random. Those are the only possibilities. How do you get out of that?
So you're saying if I have libertarian free will, you would say my option would have to be what? I'd have to make what? Which one of those two? Which I already think is a false dichotomy. But let's.
Well, I think libertarian free will is like a round square. It's not possible. You cannot have libertarian free will. It's a non-existent thing.
Why?
So because it's logically impossible. Everything you do is either done for reasons, in which case it's determined, or it's done for no reasons, in which case it's random. If it's determined, you didn't have a choice, so there's no libertarian free will. If it's random, you didn't have a choice, so there's no libertarian free will. There is no possibility of libertarian free will. It's logically impossible.
That was more of a yes or no. But even though you're determined to believe that, and you could not have believed otherwise, I disagree. Define what is libertarian free will.
I would say it's the ability to make a choice independent of like coercion or something like that.
I'm asking you what your view is.
I think that was the definition. I'm just trying to, because I think it's impossible. So,
right, but I mean, you have to know what it is that you think is impossible before you can call something impossible, right?
Right. So I think it's the ability to make a decision independent of any kind of coercion. I don't remember what the actual word is, but it's some kind of force.
Okay.
So how do you define it?
Well, I already told you, but it's a little disappointing that you can't define it, but you're telling me it's impossible.
Right, because I've looked up the definition before. You want me to look it up again?
I mean, no, I know. I want to know what you believe, not what you can look up on Google.
Right, and I've already stated that it's the ability to make a decision independent of being forced to make the decision. If you are forced to make the decision, it is not free. It is not a choice. You are determined. So you do not have libertarian free will if you are forced to make the decision independent of some free choice thing.
And how do you know that we're forced to make all decisions?
Because it's logically impossible for you not to be. The only two options are either you're determined, so you are forced, or you have not determined because there's no reason there, in which case it's random. It's the only possibilities.
You keep making that assertion, but that's not an argument. You're just making assertions here. Why can I not be the first mover of my will?
Because it's not logically possible. So if you can show that this is not a dichotomy, if you can show that there's a way out, that's great. But if you can't, it's a dichotomy. Like if I say it's P or not P, you can say, well, no, there's another option. You have to actually show the other option here, because I've demonstrated P or not P. Either you do things for reasons, in which case it's determined, or you do not do things for reasons, in which case it's random. By definition, that's what random means, not done for reasons. Those are the only options. That is a deductive dichotomy. It is P or not P. Logically, it makes perfect sense here. You have to actually show that this is a false dichotomy in some sense.
Okay, so every time I ask why I can't have libertarian freedom, you say because it's impossible. And then you go over your dichotomy.
Right.
Then, okay, that doesn't show it's not possible for me to be the first mover of my will or actions. In other words, what if I said I choose to believe stuff freely, libertarianly freely, based on reasons? Would you be okay with that?
Well, that would just be compatibilism, so it would just be determinism.
No. Why must you assume determinism, other than the fact that you're determined to believe that? But why must you assume determinism?
Because there isn't another logical possibility. You can't insert something to get out of that dichotomy. Like it's like if I say a square has four sides and a circle does not have four sides, then you can't have a round square.
Okay, just because
you want to believe in a round square, that you use your libertarian to believe in a round square, doesn't make it any more possible. It's still impossible.
Okay. Just because you use an illustration with your assertion doesn't make it an argument. So
actually, it is in fact an argument. It's a very common argument. It's why pretty much every philosopher rejects free will as any kind of
really. That's news to me.
Yeah, 75% of philosophers are naturalists. In case you didn't know.
Well, I don't know if it's 75%, but of course, truth isn't.
Phil Papers survey, 75%.
Okay, yeah, great. So, and you're determined to believe that too. Back to the whole free will thing. So, everything I believe and do, I'm forced to do, and you're saying it's logically impossible for me to freely choose to believe something without being forced to.
Right.
Okay, well, I guess we agree to disagree there, because I don't think you've bared the burden to prove that, and I don't know how you could prove that everything is determined.
Well, I mean, are you dissatisfied with a logical proof that a square cannot be round? I mean, because that's all I did.
I'm dissatisfied with the fact.
I used the exact same proof that philosophers use to show that squares can't be
No,
round. So if you reject that, I mean, okay,
no, no. I'm dissatisfied with the fact that you keep making an assertion and then using an analogy as if an analogy with an assertion is an argument. That's what I'm
right,
dissatisfied.
right.
Yeah,
Just like how philosophers prove that squares can't be round. Yes, it's the exact same argument with the exact same structure
you
and the
just did it.
exact same philosophical grounding there. So
You,
yeah.
you
I mean,
just
I don't know why you keep saying it's an assertion and it's not an argument. It's literally the
okay.
paradigmatic philosophical argument.
Okay, you're saying it's impossible, like this. That's an assertion with an illustration.
I'm saying it's impossible because it's contradictory. Yes.
Right. Right. That's what the analogy aims to show.
Yes. Just like a round square, that's the same thing. I don't
I'm
see how
saying
do you see there's a difference between these two things?
no, you're making it. Okay, if I say libertarian free will exists, and you say why? Because it's impossible for it not to exist. How? I say, well, it's just like a squared circle. Libertarian free will exists because it's impossible for it not to exist, just like a squared circle. Everybody believes that. 75% of my Facebook friends think so, and there you go.
Right. You'd have to actually have some kind of philosophical argument to understand why it would be necessary to exist. Like the argument I gave right there, where everything you do is done for reasons, or it's done for no reasons, therefore it's either determined or it's random. And libertarian free will is not determined or not random by definition. So you can't have libertarian free will because every decision you make is either determined or random.
Okay, so on your view, I claim I believe stuff because I have reasons that I freely choose to investigate and come to a conclusion, and you call it determinism.
Right, because all of your reasons are determined. You are determined to believe those reasons, or you are determined not to believe those reasons. You don't get a choice.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess we could move on here because this is a second dead horse we've beat. So let's talk about consciousness. So you don't think consciousness is immaterial, right?
No, I think the best evidence we have is that it's material. It could be a material. I can't prove it, but I
How
think we have no reason to
can we
believe.
have evidence for that?
Same way we have evidence for everything by making future testable predictions. If the consciousness is produced by the brain, then we can predict that if we damage the brain in some way, we can affect consciousness, and we can damage the brain and affect consciousness. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that consciousness is produced by material processes.
Okay, so far you've said consciousness is produced by the brain, which could be a still dualism. That'd be property dualism. So that doesn't prove what you're saying. And then
Correct.
you said,
Just to
oh,
clarify,
hold on. Let me finish because you made 2 points.
you know,
And then you said that yeah, you can have brain damage and stuff like that, and that can alter mental states or memory. That would show that there's a correlation or a cause effect relation there, but that wouldn't show that it is physical. That's not an example of identity. So the very 2 things you gave me, neither one of those 2 things prove consciousness would be physical.
correct. That's true of all of science. All of science can't prove causation. All of science can't prove anything with absolute
It
certainty.
want to be evidence. I'm not talking about certainty. It want to be evidence for consciousness being physical.
Well, no, because we can say the same thing about the whole world could have been created 5 minutes ago, which could explain everything. So therefore, we don't have evidence to believe that the world revolves around the sun. Because, well, no, we don't have any evidence of that since the world was created 5 minutes ago. The fact that we have all of this stuff on our references that seems to indicate that, well, that's not actually evidence that the world revolves around the sun because the world could have been created 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
The fact that there are alternative hypotheses doesn't actually mean that it's not evidence of the one that makes the testable predictions.
That's
The
funny
fact that
because
it makes testable predictions means it is evidence.
okay, hold on. And that's funny because you do the very same thing that you're saying I'm doing when it comes to God. But let's set that aside.
What do you
I
mean?
asked you for evidence, and you gave me those 2 things, and then you said, "Well, no, it's not evidence for it." Is it evidence for it or not that consciousness is physical?
Yes, it's evidence for it, but it's not proof.
Okay, so let's call it. So I'm saying it's not evidence for it.
Okay, is the fact that we can make measurements of the light curving around the sun evidence that the Earth revolves around the sun?
I could care less. We're talking about consciousness here. You
Well, that's what I'm
said
saying. It meets the standard of evidence that every scientific claim meets.
okay.
for
So now you're also now throwing this in there. You're assuming that the question of consciousness is a scientific question. Why?
Well, no, I'm saying that what makes evidence evidence is the fact that we can use some preconceived hypothesis to make predictions about things we did not know. And if we can do that and confirm them, that is evidence that the hypothesis is correct. That's true of all of science. That's what science does.
Yeah.
So we can make a preconceived hypothesis that consciousness is material. And with that hypothesis, we can make predictions about if we damage the brain in this way, we can see these kinds of effects on consciousness, which we see,
Okay.
which is therefore evidence of the hypothesis, exactly like saying the Earth revolves around the sun. For every scientific hypothesis works that way.
Okay. No, not necessarily. And so I guess your answer to my question was yes, you do think it's a scientific question. That was
Not sort of. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say it's not a scientific question. What do you
I'm
mean?
asking you. So you think this is a scientific question?
I'm not sure what you mean by scientific
Well, you
question. Could
said
you
it.
elaborate on that? Oh, I didn't say it. You said it.
Yeah, you said that that's how we do things through science. Then you started talking about science and
Right,
scientific.
right. So science is a way to determine things that exist in reality that are not simply a part of your imagination. So we have to
Mhm.
use some kind of methodology to differentiate between some imaginary thing and whether or not this thing actually exists in the world. And the way we do that is we make future testable predictions.
Okay.
Now, we can scientifically approach the supernatural. If you can show future testable predictions with the supernatural, that can be assessed by science
Okay.
too. So I don't see there's like a
Hold on.
scientific question.
Okay, you're making like 5 points in a sentence, so we got to go one at a time here. Um, Scientific investigation for supernatural. I think that's absurd and category fallacy, but we'll set that aside. There's something else you said that I forgot, and I don't write as that fast. Um, so, are you familiar with empirically equivalent theories?
Yes, the problem of underdetermination.
Okay, so explain empirically equivalent theories for me.
There are multiple ways to explain any set of empirical data.
No,
Infinitely many, actually.
no, that's not what empirical equivalent theories is. So there's three positions when it comes to philosophy of mind. You have strict physicalism, then you have a type of dualism, it's property dualism, then you have substance dualism. Everything you said, all the empirical data you can give could equally fit on all these three. And there is no amount of data that you or I would disagree with that would prove one position over the other. That's what it
Right,
means.
which is exactly what I said. There are multiple different hypotheses that can explain all of the empirical data. And no, what you
Not
said is
just
wrong. There are three theories about the mind, which are physicalism, dualism, and idealism. So, but yes, that is the problem of underdetermination. There are infinitely many ways to explain any set of data. That's true. There are infinitely many ways to explain all of the empirical scientific data we have of everything. We can say the entire world was created 5 minutes ago, or 6 minutes ago, or 7 minutes ago. That
not
doesn't mean we don't have evidence of the things that we can see around us. Like we can show we have evidence that the Earth goes around the sun. That's fine. It meets the standard of what qualifies as empirical scientific evidence. Does it prove it? No. Could there be other ways to explain it? Yes. There could be infinitely many other ways to explain it, but that's the best conclusion we have because we have a hypothesis that makes future predictions that are confirmed, which is the same with consciousness.
okay. So again, you're saying a lot, and I need to start writing more. So why do okay? Let me go about it this way, because every time I ask a question, you'd like make 5 more points. The fact that um, you can change stuff in my brain, or I can have brain damage, and it'll affect my mental state. Why do you think? I mean, did you use that as an example, as if that would somehow disprove that consciousness is immaterial, or do you think that's something that only fits on your perspective? Because I've heard you say before, if it counts for one everything, then it counts for nothing.
Right. So there are always infinitely many ways to explain anything. So you can actually explain all of the data with dualism or idealism or physicalism. They can all explain all of the data. But to have one explanation that is more supported than the other, what you have to do is you have to take the explanation and make future predictions. Say,
No, that because if it explains all the data with all those three positions, then all those three positions can make future predictions, and they can all be the same. That's empirically equivalent.
no,
Yes.
not so all of the past and present data can be explained by infinitely many theories. Like, for example, I can say we saw a cup fall over. That could be explained by magical leprechauns or fairies or something. But I didn't, in order to say that that was a justified belief, I would have to take that hypothesis, say, if it was fairies, then I can predict this other thing, which will also be discovered to be true, which we don't know yet. And if I can discover that is true, then I have a reason to believe it was the fairies, because we can predict more stuff in the future that we don't know yet.
Okay.
And if you can do that, that is a good reason to believe in fairies.
Okay. Let's
We can do that with the physical one. We can't do it with the dualism or the idealism.
okay. Let's set the fairs aside, because I think what you said last is where I want to get to. Give me a future test or prediction you can make that would fit the position that consciousness is physical that I could not make, given that I believe consciousness is immaterial.
We'll be able to make consciousness with artificial intelligence and computers.
And how would you know that they're conscious?
Well, we do it the same way we know that I know you're conscious. I just do it based off inductive analysis. I can't prove you're conscious.
So,
I have sufficient reason to believe you're conscious.
are you familiar with John Searle's Chinese room experiment?
Right, that's a metaphysical question, which is irrelevant. I can still believe that you're conscious, even though I don't know it for sure.
This is all metaphysical. We've been talking metaphysics for the past 5 minutes.
Sort of, no. We've been talking epistemology. Like
No.
all science is epistemology. Science says nothing about metaphysics. We're
Okay.
talking about scientific how the brain functions and
Okay.
physicalism. That's all epistemology. It's
Okay.
not
First of all,
metaphysics.
yes, this is metaphysics, and that might be true if your position is correct. But remember, I don't think consciousness. I know consciousness is not physical, so it's not a scientific question. John Searles, back to John Searles' Chinese room experiment. You know that he argues that basically mimicking behavior of consciousness does not show something's conscious.
Right, and that also applies to supernatural too. The supernatural also can't solve that problem.
Okay, don't slide that in there. Let's stick to consciousness. So, what is consciousness? What would you say consciousness is? Because I don't even know how you would determine whether or not AI is conscious.
Well, I just say it's the conscious experience, I guess.
Right, but that would be the AI, the robot having that experience. How would you know that the
I would
robot?
determine it the exact same way I determine you have conscious. If it can do everything you can do, I'm going to say it's conscious.
So, what about some robots now? Or I mean, do you think computers are conscious?
No,
No, why not?
because they don't have the ability to learn and process and react in the same way a human does.
Okay, so why
Or an
can't it
animal
have like a
does.
lower form of conscious then? Why can't that be a lower form of conscious?
It could be. I don't know.
Okay, so why say it's not?
Because I don't have any reason to believe it is. Like I'd have to actually be justified in the conclusion it is kind of a consciousness.
And where would you draw the line when it comes to AI? Like, why, they in China and other places are making these weird looking robots that look pretty human, and you can have some sort of a conversation with them. I mean, how do you know is that conscious? I don't know. Maybe you think it is.
No, I'd say that they need to be able to do pretty much everything humans can do for the most part.
Okay, so an infant would an infant be conscious?
Possibly.
Possibly. You don't know if an infant is conscious.
If an AI could do what an infant
I'm talking about
could do, would I consider it conscious? Possibly, possibly not.
no. I'm talking about infants. Are infants conscious?
Actually, I assume so, yes.
Okay, but they can't do everything you and I can do, right?
Right. So where I would draw the line is when I'm going to say a computer is conscious when it can do what we assume or what we label as what most humans can do, an adult human can do. That's when I'm going to label it conscious.
Okay, but only for robots, not humans, right?
Right. I have a higher standard for robots because we don't have a biological system that can show that they lead into the others across a certain amount of years.
Say that again. We don't have a biological system.
We know kids grow into parents, and we know parents are conscious, so we can assume the kids are probably conscious too.
Probably.
But we don't have that for computers. So I'm going to say my standard for what a computer would have to do before I would call it conscious would be as much as an adult human would be.
Why would you say children are probably conscious?
Well, it depends on what consciousness is. Like we don't actually know what consciousness is.
I do.
No, you don't. Have you published a paper in any academic journal? Have you solved all the problems in every field of philosophy and biology and neurology? No. You can assert you do. You don't know anything.
All right, and you can assert I don't.
Right, I can.
Yeah. So that word, he said, she said, right? I know you are, but what am I? So, what about the people who have done? I mean, work in this, and why can't I know what consciousness is? I'm a little offended.
Why can't you know what conscious? Like
Yeah.
no one knows what consciousness is.
No one.
No one.
Really?
It's one of the biggest unsolved problems in all of everything about the universe we don't know.
So the one thing that we know the
If you
most.
can solve this, you will be like world famous in a matter of days. Like this is a pretty big issue. Like
Yeah.
please publish a paper, enlighten the rest of us. What is consciousness, please?
Well, there's lots of books out there I can give you. I can even buy them for you if you'd like.
Right, and they're not accepted. They're not accepted for a reason. None of them are taken seriously.
Accepted by who, Tom?
Accepted by the world. Like if you could actually demonstrate what consciousness was to a scientific level, like Einstein demonstrated what general relativity was, you would be world famous in a matter of days.
Right. Okay. So the very thing that we know the most about, our mental lives, which is consciousness, you say we know nothing about.
Yes, the fact that we know about our conscious experience doesn't mean we know what conscious experience is.
Really? You don't know what conscious
Yes.
experience is?
Yes. The fact that we experience it doesn't mean we know what it is. I mean, we experienced colors before we knew what colors were. We experienced optical illusions before we knew what optical illusions were. The fact that we experienced something doesn't mean we know about it.
So consciousness is not an experience?
Consciousness is an experience. Why?
Okay. All right. Well, then I guess we know about it, huh?
Right, and we experienced colors too before we actually knew what colors were and how photons flew into the eyes and how the eyes process information. The fact that we experience it doesn't mean we know anything about it.
Tom, so colors are photons.
Yes, colors are photons processed by the retina in the eye, processed to the brain. Yes.
So you need an eye to see color.
Yes. Or you need a brain that gives you the signals that precede color. Yes.
Would you say you need light to see color and photons to see color? Or
You just need the electrical signals in the brain that produce color. Yes.
So if you close your eyes and I ask you to see a pink elephant, would you see a pink elephant?
No, I can imagine an elephant. I wouldn't
Right, you
see
would
one.
imagine. Would you so you'd have an experience of a pink elephant in your mind?
I would imagine one. I wouldn't see one.
Well, to see in the sense that you'd have that sensation, it'd be a mental state, right?
Right. That's because your visual cortex, what it does is it mimics the sensations given to you when you see something.
It mimics photons.
Yes, that's exactly how your brain
Really?
images things. It mimics the image when
With my
you
eyes
see
closed.
it.
With my eyes
Yes.
closed, it mimics
Yes.
photons. That's incredible.
It mimics the sensation in the brain produced by the photons interacting with your eye.
Oh, so now the sensation is in my brain.
Yes, it's
So
always been in your brain.
really? So could I crack your? I wouldn't never do this. I'm a Christian, right? Slight joke there. I would never crack open your brain, but if I were, let's say, a surgeon and opening your brain, I'd see that pink elephant in there.
Not exactly. Like they have done experiments with cats where they or baboons.
Exactly.
We don't have that level of quality in the brain. And once we do, yes, the answer is yes. You will be able to find the pink elephant in the brain. We know for a fact that we can show a certain picture of a pattern to it was either a baboon or a cat, put a radiometric dye in the brain, kill the cat, cut open the brain, and put the brain up against a piece of paper to read the radiometric data, and we find the image of the picture that they looked at on the paper. So yes, we can find the physical image of what you're looking at or imagining in the brain.
So
Yes.
in the brain that's on the paper.
In the brain, yes. And so
You said
we
on the paper. Which one is it?
so we take the brain, we cut
Uh-huh.
it in half,
Yes.
we stick the brain on the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So the residue in the brain gets on the paper. So it's in the brain, and then it becomes on the paper because you put the paper on the brain. So it's in the brain.
Oh, okay. So if I get a CD and I break it, will like notes and like the note C like fall out of it or songs fall out of it?
No,
Is music inside the CD?
no, ones and zeros on the other side of the CD.
Oh, okay, right. So the brain though, but that does have the music in there.
Right. For many things, yes, the brain physically processes the information. So yes,
That sounds like special
physical
programming.
shapes. No, for some things like physical shapes, the brain literally creates the physical shapes. Yes.
And if you open up my brain and put it against a piece of paper, some physical shapes will pop out and some songs will pop out.
Physical shapes, yes. You're not going to find songs that way.
Why not? If you
Because it's a different medium. You couldn't. I don't know what kind of shape. Like there's sounds, not physical shapes. So you wouldn't be able to see a shape of a sound. But maybe it's like if there was a way to like read audio from the brain, then you could produce a song from hearing someone think about it.
kind of like a CD, huh?
Sort of.
Huh.
But CD is in ones and zeros.
Right. So neurons firing.
To have some way to translate the ones and zeros into the song.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Use the word translate. So, but when it comes to the brain, it's not in there. That bad boy is in there. That pink elephant, it's boom in my brain.
Physical shapes, yes. Physical shapes are actually processed in the visual cortex. Yes, the physical shape is there.
They're not translated there. They're there. Like, how big is that elephant that would be in my brain? Because I'm impressed that you think a pink elephant fit in my brain.
Right, because that's what happens in the brain. That's how the brain processes information. We can do the experiment. There are published papers on this where they cut open a brain, have it have an image in there. We've seen that happen. Okay. We can prove this and scientifically. We've got this down.
Okay, I'm shocked. Okay, we're on AI because I think the point's been made. I heard someone once say, "I don't even need to respond to that. I just need to make sure the audience understood what you're saying, and that's sufficient for me." So if you think elephant could be in my brain,
that's correct. Yes,
that's fine with me. Okay. So let me give you an argument. You tell me what you think. And you probably, if you've seen in my videos, you probably have heard me use this illustration or argument, which you can find at YouTube/C/Eric Hernandez. Short, shameless plug. So I would claim that consciousness is not physical because the properties of the mind are not shared by the properties of the brain and vice versa. And I'm assuming you're familiar with Leibniz's law of identity.
Yep.
Okay. So, well, let me just go ahead and, given that you're familiar with it, for the listeners who may not be familiar with it. So, according to Leibniz's law of identity, if two things are the same thing, then they share all the same properties. If they don't, then they're not the same thing. So, let's take a mental state like a belief. A belief can be true or false, and that belief can be corresponded and correlated with neurons firing in my brain, but the neurons themselves are not true or false, but my belief is true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but my beliefs don't weigh 3 pounds. The sensation of a red or a pink elephant, which is in my mind, that can versus an actual pink elephant. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the thought of a pink elephant, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. There's a lot more we can go through. We can talk about qualia, uh, um, aboutness, ofness. I forget the word escapes me, but you get where I'm going here. So, what would you do with that? That the properties of the mind are not shared with the properties of the brain?
Composition division fallacy. Like I could say the properties of an ocean are not the same as the properties of hydrogen and oxygen molecules. The properties of the sun are not the same as the properties of the hydrogen that makes up the sun. The fact that the collection of things has different properties from the individual parts of the thing doesn't mean that they can't be made up of the individual things.
Okay, but that's not my point. So, okay, because you would agree that a drop of water is wet and the ocean's wet, yes?
I don't think a drop of water can. I'm not. Maybe. Yeah, I guess so. A drop of water can be wet, but a single molecule of water probably wouldn't be wet.
Okay, let's stick to what I'm saying. A drop of water can be wet, and the ocean can be wet, right?
Right.
Because they're the same thing. They're water. They share the same properties. I'm saying in principle, there is no shareable properties between the mind and brain.
Right. I can just refute your point there by saying a single molecule of water isn't wet, but it's still water.
Molecule of water. We're talking about a drop of water. Those two things.
Or no, your argument was there. You're saying they're the same thing, therefore they have the same properties. But a molecule of water is still the same thing, but it doesn't have those properties. So that refutes your point.
So water's not wet. And what do you mean?
A single molecule of water is not wet. No.
What do you mean by a single molecule? H2O is not wet.
H2O is not wet. It's not wet.
Okay, yeah. I've when I used to substitute at school, I heard 8th graders arguing about whether or not water's wet. But I don't want to go on a tangent about the water thing. I really don't. My thoughts can be true or false. No part of my brain's true or false. You think that's a what fallacy?
Composition division, or the truth or falsity of the claims is something that's independent of your brain. So the fact that your beliefs are true or false has nothing to do with your brain. It's kind of like that. What?
Right. I said good. So that means that your mind and brain are the same thing.
No, the beliefs that you have in your head, whether or not they're true, has nothing to do with your brain or your mind at all. They're completely irrelevant. So remember earlier in our discussion, you said you have a belief and you're determined to believe it. Mm-hmm. The fact that you're determined to believe it is independent from whether or not it's true or whether or not it's justified. It's the same thing. So the fact that your brain is determined to believe something or believes something that is true is independent of the truth. The truth of it is something that's outside of your brain. So there's no contradiction there.
Okay, so I don't believe your brain thinks, first of all. I don't think your thoughts and your consciousness is in your brain. So that wouldn't apply to what I'm saying. But the fact that the mind and brain don't share, are there any properties that the mind and brain share?
What do you mean? Like they do stuff? Vision?
No, okay, so
visual experience, auditory experience, touch, taste.
That's all consciousness, yeah. So mental state. There are ways that philosophy. So assuming you've read the books and you say, so many percentage of people reject this and that, and the world believes this or that. So I'm assuming you have an answer to the question: how do you identify a mental state?
How do I identify a mental state? Is the same way I identify a brain state.
Okay, so are mental states the same thing as brain states?
By my definition, yes.
Okay, right. Then they should share the same properties.
No, again, the same thing with the composition division fallacy.
No.
The sun is made of hydrogen, but the sun has more properties than hydrogen does.
No, stop. You're not following me here. If a mental state is, and by is you mean literally the same thing as, then we're using two different phrases or names or terms to talk about the same thing. If I'd say TJump or the guy I'm talking to right now online, I'm using two different titles reference to talk about the same person. So whatever's true of TJump is going to be true of the guy I'm talking to online because they're the same person. If you're going to claim that mental states and brain states are the same thing, then they're going to share the same properties. It's that
mental states are some brain states. Not all brain states are mental states. Some things your brains do. You don't have any mental conception of what at all. So there is some part of your brain states that are mental states. Just like there are some parts of like hydrogen that share the same properties with sun, but they're not all the same.
So okay. Now you're doing that fallacy, the composition thing there. Okay, let's okay. What in your mind? What is a thought?
I have no idea. I just think thoughts are the things we're experiencing.
Physically, what's a thought? Because it's physical. I'm assuming.
Right. So it's something in the brain. I have no idea what.
You don't know what a thought is.
It's something in the brain, as far as I know. I don't know what it is.
So would you?
I don't have a full solution to neurology and how consciousness works.
Okay, well, there's nothing to do with neurology. Okay, anyways, so A thought to you would have to be some type of a brain state, right? Neurons firing, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you have thought X, your brain does something, right?
Yes.
And those are the same thing.
Yes.
Okay, then they should share the same properties, just like
No.
Jump.
No.
Come on, man, you're killing me here.
It's like a computer. A computer has ones and zeros. Everything on a computer is a set of ones and zeros, but when you look at the screen, you don't see ones and zeros. This is
Okay,
not a problem.
so right, because they're not the same thing.
What do you? They're all ones and zeros. Like that's it.
But the ones and zeros and the image on my screen is not the same thing.
Okay. Could you explain that to me? What do you mean?
Ones and zeros are not the same. Okay, so the grooves on a CD are not the same thing as the music itself, correct?
The grooves on the CD are the way the thing that's reading it creates the music.
Not what I asked.
So, well, this is the same thing as consciousness. So the way that you experience consciousness is because of your brain is doing all of the ones and zeros in the background, creating this idea or this experience of consciousness, like the screen on your computer. Now, I don't know exactly what you mean by the same here, because I see those as all the same process.
Go back
It's all
to the
just
CD
ones and
thing.
zeros.
Go back to the CD thing. The grooves on the CD, is that the same thing as the music? Is it literally the music?
No.
Okay, right. So we agree so far. I'm saying it's the same thing with the brain and the mind. And I think you would agree here because, and I'm not sure if you've even, as boldly as you've claimed, we don't know what consciousness is, and you talk about consciousness and philosophy of mind. I'm not even sure if you know what your position is, because I would say you're some type of a property dualist, because earlier you said that the brain consciousness is something produced by the brain, which already entail that they're not the same thing.
Well, it's just the way we talk about it. I would say that it is a brain state. It's something in the brain. So, but I'm definitely not a property dualist, because dualism is completely incoherent because of the problem of the interaction problem.
Yeah, that doesn't make it incoherent. We can get to that if you want. Let's one thing at a time here. So
just to clarify, my position is that conscious experience is like the screen on your computer. You got a bunch of ones and zeros, which we can correlate to the neurons interacting, which create a screen on the computer. So even though they aren't literally the exact same in every conceivable way, the screen on the computer is a result of the ones and the zeros.
okay, I'm fine with saying that, but you'd have to concede there that they're not the same thing.
Right. If you want to say it in that same respect, yes. But I'm still saying they're material. So they're the same in the material sense.
Okay, sure. Okay, so they're both material, but they're not the same thing. That's fine.
Okay. I'm happy to grant that. If you want to mean the same thing in that literally way, yes. Okay, they're not the exact same thing. Okay.
Again, coming from someone who was so confident that we didn't know anything about consciousness and all this other stuff, and saying go get a Nobel Prize and prove this or that, surely you'd have to know what identity means. I mean, it's a strict metaphysical term, which is what we've been talking about metaphysics for the past 30 minutes or so. So that's what identity means. It literally means the same thing as.
Right. And the problem of identity is a big problem in philosophy that we can't solve for anything. Okay. So I'm talking more about epistemic identity and what we can demonstrate scientifically. As far as we know, scientifically, there are things in the brain.
But if we're talking philosophy of mind, then you should know how I'm using identity, and especially the way I laid it out. And then I even said Leibniz's law of identity. So I mean, I would just recommend not to be coming off so strong if you're not familiar with the area or the field.
No, I'm fairly familiar with the area. Identity doesn't have anything to do with the problem of mind. Identity has to do with the problem of identity and the law of identity, which is a more broad topic. So no.
Leibniz's law of identity.
Right.
It's the law of identity. It's the difference there. It's philosophy of mind 101 stuff. Okay, so because you give me two different answers, but maybe we should move on here. But so consciousness is not literally the same thing as the brain. But
consciousness is a result of the brain.
Okay, right. So then
neurological process. It is not the exact same because there's other things the brain does which are not conscious.
Okay, so your answer is yes, that you agree with me that it's not the same thing. You think it's just still something physical.
Right. It is a process of the brain.
Explain that.
It is a result of interactions in the brain, but there are all kinds of other interactions in the brain that do not result in consciousness.
So if I get a guitar and I, play a note, which is the result of pressing certain strings and plucking certain strings, would it follow that the note C is the same thing as me plucking strings?
The note C is the vibration of the sound wave produced by the vibration of the guitar strings.
Okay, I disagree, but your answer is no. So okay, we got that. So it's not. So that's what I'm saying there. So I think so. I'm almost even kind of helping you
So
formulate.
note C is a result of the process of the strings wiggling.
Right. So it's not the same thing as
Right,
pressing.
it's a process of result of the strings. So
I
the consciousness
understand.
is a result of the processes
Then
of the brain, or is a process of the brain.
I understand that. So then you consider yourself a functionalist?
I don't know. I don't have a strict position on consciousness because I don't know what it is.
Well, that's what it sounds like. You don't know what it is, but you know it's physical.
The best evidence we have indicates it's physical. We have no reason to believe it
What
otherwise.
evidence? Now it feels like we're going back in a circle. What
Right,
evidence is it?
evidence is the ability to make future testable predictions that are confirmed. Idealism cannot do that and has never done that. Dualism cannot do that and has never done that. Physicalism can do that. So we have evidence for physicalism. We don't have evidence of anything else.
Okay, but you concede, didn't you concede earlier that they're empirically equivalent?
Again, there are always empirical equivalencies for everything. We can explain everything with empirically equivalent theories for literally all scientific data for everything. It does not
Being ad hoc is what I'm saying. Without being ad hoc. I mean,
right.
Okay.
So,
Wow.
so the point is that the most supported ones are the ones we have scientific data for, which is the ability to make testable predictions.
Okay.
There are still always going to be infinitely many empirically equivalent alternatives. It's the problem of underdetermination. It applies to everything. We don't have a way to prove one is absolutely correct. All we have is the ability to make future testable predictions, which gives us reason to believe this one is better than the other.
So
we have that for physicalism.
Okay. So I'm going to try this again then. Give me the evidence that consciousness is physical.
Future testable predictions, we can damage the brain and it'll cause effects on consciousness.
And I can't explain that.
You can always explain any set of data with infinitely many empirically equivalent data that does not make it not evidence.
How is that evidence for? Which is funny because when it comes to God, you say the complete opposite against theists, which I think is disingenuous at this point.
No, if all of the evidence works equally as well for all of the alternatives, then none of it's actually evidence for one or the other.
Okay, good.
The fact that we can make testable predictions before we know them and get them right is only true under physicalism. It is not true for the dualism. It is not true for idealism. So it only works for physicalism.
All the evidence you can give, any empirical evidence you can give, can work for all three positions.
Right, in the past or in the present, but not in the future. The only one that can make future testable predictions is physicalism, which physicalism now has more evidence because it has one thing the others don't.
Which is that you
Future
think to be conscious, that hopefully can do more than infants, which I think is even that criteria of itself is it's pretty wild.
That's just a criteria I made up for what would satisfy me. It has nothing to do with the science.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, but I think it's a wildly made up, ad hoc, arbitrary, whatever you want to call it. I don't even know what you want to call it. So the evidence that consciousness is physical is that you think AI will be conscious, although you can't know whether or not it's conscious. How do you know? Let's try this. Maybe we can start to shift a little bit. How do you know when you're in pain?
The sensation of pain. When I have the sensation of pain.
Right. And is that something you know by means of the physical?
No.
Good. We agree on something. Okay, right. Because I would say that pain, which is a qualia, which is a conscious thing. Qualia is not physical. It's the experience of a mental state, the qualitative texture, if you will, of a mental state. Right. So it's not physical. Would you agree with that then?
Well, I'd say it's not a physical means in the scientific sense, but we can then look in the brain and see that there is an electrical signal and say, yep, that person's in pain because they have the physical sensation of pain. So we can learn of pain by looking at the physical. We don't do that because it would be tedious. We can just experience pain. So we don't actually look at the physical mechanisms of the brain to know we're in pain. We just feel pain. But we can.
So let me rephrase what you said, how I would put it, and you tell me what you think about it. I want to hear what you think. So when I have an experience of pain, it's in my mind, which is not in my brain, and there's a correlating, kind of like the guitar, the CD thing, there is a correlation of a brain state, but looking at my brain state doesn't necessarily tell me what mental state I'm in, but there is a correlation between the two.
Right. Just like there's a correlation in everything in science. What's equally supported is all scientific.
Okay, I don't know what you meant by the last part, but I want to focus on this. When you say right, you agree with me, right? As in that pain is in the mind, which is not in the brain?
No, pain is in the brain, and we look at the brain to gain the correlation between the two sensations. We can't prove it metaphysically, but that's just how science works.
What two sensations?
What?
What two sensations?
We can look in the brain to find the sensations. So we can see the sensations are occurring by looking at what's in the brain. Like we can see pain is occurring because of the sensations that go through your body.
Sensations in the brain. Yeah, I'm still not getting that.
The electrical signals.
Okay, right. So that wouldn't be the sensation, though. An electrical signal would not be a sensation of pain.
Yeah, the electrical signals are what result in the sensation of pain.
Sure, I wouldn't word it that way, but okay, right. So there's a correlation. So when you look at, in other words, and here's what I'm also getting at, you don't have to look at anything in your brain to know about what mental state you're in.
Right.
Okay. And I'm arguing it's because, one, it's not physical. So you couldn't describe pain by any physical neurological mechanisms. Would you agree with that?
No, that just means we don't understand it enough to be able to translate things in the brain to conscious experience and how to go between those two.
What do you mean by understand it? What's the it you're referring to?
The consciousness part. We don't know how to go from physical stuff in the brain to qualia experience yet.
Okay, but okay, hold on. Quality. I don't think quality experience is physical.
It's like your CD example where you said, are the bumps on the CD the same as the song? Like, yes, if you find a way to translate one to the other, then yes, the bumps on the CD are the same as the song. It's just a different language.
Right.
Same thing as with the brain. It's like the stuff in the brain, the mental, neurological stuff is the same as the stuff you're seeing. We just don't know how to translate those yet.
Okay. No, the CD, the grooves in the CD are not the same thing as the songs. I mean, I don't know. I'm at a loss for words that you'd even say that. They're not the same
language of the same thing. It's just a different
language. There's a cause and effect relationship, but a cause-effect relationship does not establish identity. And by identity, again, means that literally the same thing as. Eric Hernandez is identical to Kendall Hernandez's husband. That's my wife. That is identity. But showing a cause-effect relationship or even a dependence relationship is not identity.
Right, and I'm not saying literally the same in every conceivable way. I'm not using identity in that sense.
Right. Well, that's what identity is. So then I would say just change your use of words, because when we're talking philosophy of mind,
I'm going to stick with the definitions that philosophers actually use. No. So when I say the song is the same, I mean it's the same general thing, but it's not the exact same. Like we are the same species, we are not the exact same. So when the song is the general same thing, it is just a different expression of the same language, or different expression of the same ideas in a different language.
What did you say earlier about philosophers' definitions?
I'm going to stick with philosophers' definitions. I'm not going to go with.
That's what I'm doing. That's not what you're doing. That's what I'm doing.
I'm sorry.
You couldn't even define identity to me earlier, and then you were unfamiliar with it. I'm talking about what the philosophers are using.
No, you're not. You're not even close.
Okay, well,
most philosophers reject pretty much everything you've said.
Really? Wow.
Are materialists. 4% are dualists like you. It's a joke position.
You don't even know what I was saying, but yet you know that most philosophers.
Right, because I don't really understand your position. You're not using different definitions than what I'm familiar with, and I actually talk with
them. So, okay, so pain. Let me try it one more time. Is pain physical? Yes or no?
Yes, pain is a result of the physical processes in the mind. Yes.
I didn't ask is the result. Is it?
Yes, it is a physical result of physical processes in the mind.
Okay. What do you in the mind? But by mind you mean brain.
Brain, yes.
Okay.
I consider them the same. So if I use them, it's by habit.
Okay. No, understandable. I'd say it's kind of how we're made, right? So, where do I want to go from here? I don't know. Is there anything you want to ask me? Because I mean, I think the points kind of make themselves here at this point.
Well, you said you had a solution to the interaction problem.
No, I didn't say I had. Well, I didn't necessarily say I had a solution. I said that doesn't disprove that there's no soul.
Well, I said it made dualism incoherent.
Why?
You said it did not make dualism incoherent or something like that.
Right. Why? Why would it make it incoherent?
Because there's absolutely no way to assess that this other entity or other aspect of reality you say exists. There's no reason to believe it isn't an imaginary thing, any different from any of the infinitely many other imaginary things that we can experience.
So ignorance makes something incoherent.
Right, because if you can't get it to interact with the things in our brain, then saying it interacts with the things in our brain is ridiculous. Like what?
No, so my question: ignorance makes something incoherent?
Yes, if you're asserting something as an explanation,
okay,
which you have no way to explain as the explanation, well, then it's incoherent. It's like saying a rabbit can cause the universe. Like what?
So are you omniscient?
No.
So you have ignorance, like I do, right?
Yes.
So are you incoherent?
No.
Okay.
But That doesn't in any way address the issue. So again, if you assert something as a solution, but it can't work as a solution based on the thing you provided, that makes it an incoherent statement. So your position is incoherent.
Let's say I give my son's one, and he, for the most part, I mean, he can grab my phone or my wife's phone, and he can kind of, he knows how to swipe here and there. So he has some type of understanding, at least, that when I do this, this works. But he perhaps cannot explain the interactions and the mechanisms behind the electrical signals within the phone. Does it mean that his understanding is incoherent, or does it mean that he's wrong, or does it mean that there is no phone, or what would you?
If he asserted a solution and said he could explain that, and he doesn't understand the things, then yes, his explanation is incoherent.
Solution to what?
So, like, if he says, I can explain how this is happening or why this functioning is occurring in the cell phone, but you just admitted he doesn't know what's causing it or doesn't know how the interaction happens, then yes, his position is incoherent because he just said he can explain something which he already admitted he can't explain.
Well, he can't even talk, so that'd be impressive even went that far. But no, I'm just,
right. So that's my point here, is that you're saying that you can explain something, but you don't know how to explain it because you can't.
What am I not going to explain? So you think the definition of a soul includes an explanation of the interaction of the mind and body, or the soul and body?
Right. If you believe that there is a mind-body dualism, and that the dualism, the mind in some way interacts with the brain, and you can't explain how it interacts with the brain, well, then you're saying you can't explain something, but it's still this unknown something.
So no. Okay. So because there's an ignorance or a lack of knowledge, or because we don't know something, or let's use me, aside from my son. I don't know how this phone works. I mean, I appreciate it. It's a little bit too expensive, but whatever. I don't know how it works, but I use it. Am I wrong in believing that the phone works?
No, you'd only be incoherent if you claimed you knew it worked, but you couldn't show it how it worked.
Okay, I know it works, but I can't tell you how it works.
The incoherence is you're claiming to know, or claiming to say that there is a mind body, there is a dualism, but then you're claiming to know you can't show how they interact. You're claiming they interact, you can't show how they interact. That's the incoherence. The problem is there's a contradiction in your position.
Okay, so in order to believe that the soul exists and it's not physical, I have to necessarily show how they interact, and if I don't, then I throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. If you don't have any reason to believe they exist and can do anything, then you have no reason to believe they exist and can do anything.
You literally think people believe in the soul because they know how it interacts with the body? Like, you think that's why people believe in the soul? Because I've never heard anyone argue for the soul and saying they believe in the soul because they know how it interacts. That's
right. Right. They believe in the soul because they believe in ridiculous things for no reason. So if you can give a good reason to believe in a soul, that's great. But as far as I know, there isn't any. And the one that would entailed in that would be to show how the soul interacts with the body.
No. Because again, I cannot show you how this phone works, but I believe it does. So we can go through arguments for the soul if you'd like, but just even if I could not explain how it interacts, it doesn't mean I'm incoherent or I can't believe that the soul exists. So they're two separate things, two separate questions. One is an ontological question. The other is an epistemic question.
You can demonstrate the phone works. You can't, if you have good reason to believe a soul exists, even if you don't know how it works, that's fine. But as far as I can tell,
good. Okay, so I can believe the soul. I can believe in the soul and have reasons and justifications for it, even if I don't know how it interacts with the body. Is that correct?
Right. I'm saying that would be the reason that you would need to justify belief in a soul, is you have to have the interaction answer.
Why?
Because there are no good reasons to believe in a soul. That would be the good reason to believe in a soul.
With the assumption that there are no good reasons to believe in the soul, then it all boils down to the interaction. I would say, actually, you'd have to first know whether or not there is a soul or could be a soul before you can even tackle the question of interaction.
You could approach it that way. So if you have other reasons to believe in a soul, that would be good too. But as far as I know, there are no reasons to believe in a soul. So if you have no solution to the interaction problem, then you have nothing.
Okay, but again, it's under your assumption, which you've admitted you have limited knowledge, that there are no reasons, or maybe the assumption that I have no reasons. I don't know. We haven't even gotten there yet. But you're acting as if I can't explain interaction, then I have nothing, because you assume there are no good reasons to believe in the soul.
So again, it's like you're confusing epistemology and metaphysics here. Like if I say Santa doesn't exist, that doesn't mean I can prove Santa doesn't exist anywhere ever, no matter what. There's just no good epistemic justification to believe Santa exists.
Okay, I'm curious. What reasons have you heard for the existence of the soul?
Quite a few. I don't really remember them because I never really took them seriously.
Really, Tom?
Yes.
Because I can think of a lot of things.
You can go through all my videos. They've come up quite a number of times. Like they're just not very impressive to me. Like, give me an example of one.
Well, Okay, so here's again the disappointing thing. If you were to ask me what I don't believe in when it comes to anything like a belief that an atheist might hold or something like that, I can give you the arguments for why someone would believe that, even if it's been a long time, because that's part of, in my mind, it's part of the justification. For you not to even be able to name an argument for the soul,
It's irrelevant entirely. That does nothing to help your position.
I haven't
The fact
finished.
that I don't remember them doesn't help you at all.
It's
So
not
I,
meant to help
I don't
me.
take them seriously because they're not relevant. They're
It's
just
not meant to
irrelevant.
help. This is not meant to help me. I'm just pointing out the fact that it's maybe a slap on the wrist, you can call it. I don't know. Take
No,
it.
you're just wasting time because that doesn't irrelevant to my position. It isn't relevant your position. It doesn't help me in any way. It doesn't help you anyway. There's nothing you're saying right now that is relevant to the
I
argument. So
think it
give me
helps.
an argument for the existence of a
I
soul, and
think
I'll
it
tell you
helps the
why it's wrong.
listeners. I think it helps the listeners. The fact that if you can't even think of one, yet you're so adamant that there is none, it
It's
says
an ad hominem fallacy. It just shows them that you don't know what you're talking about. Give me an argument for the existence of a soul. I'll show you why it's wrong.
who doesn't know what they're talking about.
You, because you're using an ad hominem. You don't remember what the arguments for the soul is. I don't need to remember them.
An ad hominem says that you're wrong because of this. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it's disappointing. It's disingenuous.
Yeah, disappointing is the same as wrong. Give me an example of an argument. I'll show you why it's wrong.
All right, so let's do what about identity through change? Do you believe that we remain the same throughout part replacement and change?
We define ourselves as a certain category of things that make up the physical body. And the physical body changes, but that category we define as ourselves does not change. So Theseus's ship, we define it as Theseus's ship, even if we change all the parts, because he owns the ship.
Okay, I don't know if that answered my question. Do you remain the same person from one moment to the next? Yes or no?
Legally, by the definition of person, yes, I remain the same
I'm not
person.
talking about legally.
Physically, by the definition of physical matter, no, I do not remain the same person.
Okay, so in the strict sense of identity, and that's another technical metaphysical term, you are not the same person from one moment to the next.
No.
So I've been talking to how many different people in the past hour that we've been talking, hour plus?
Right, because the problem of identity can't be solved for anything in any field ever.
How many people have I been?
Identity.
How many Toms have I been talking to in the past hour and a half?
Irrelevant to the bar, irrelevant to anything we've said.
Curious now at this point.
We define a person legally as the physical parts that make them up. So the legal definition, you've been talking to one.
I don't
Metaphysical definition. Metaphysics is nonsense, so it's not relevant to the topic.
I don't care about the legal because being a person is not.
Because metaphysical has no evidence. It's completely made up nonsense.
Yeah, more assertions.
Supported by all of the biggest problems in philosophy and science and every field of human knowledge. Yeah.
Which you can't even give me any arguments for, but setting that aside. So how do you define a person? Forget the legal aspect, because if there was no law, you'd still have to be able to define a person, right?
Yeah, I just define them based off the physical things that make up a human being.
Okay, so would you say personhood is a degreed property?
Maybe not.
I'm asking you.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a person.
And if you're not familiar.
Human being. No, it's just a human being.
If you're not familiar, are you familiar with degreed property? That I want to assume that you. Huh?
Yes. But it's the problem of identity, which can't be solved for anything, or the problem of people can't be solved for anything. This is not the metaphysical questions aren't relevant here. It's all epistemic. We define a person as the matter that makes up the person.
Tom, you asked me to give you some reasons, so I'm first trying to see where we're both at, so I can find where I want to go with it. Can you tell me what a non-degreed property is, or I can just say it? It's up to you.
Go ahead, just say it.
Okay. Because I'm honest, because I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little suspicious of whether or not you understand what a degreed property is, because so I want to make sure we're on the same page here. It's so some properties are degreed, some properties are non-degreed. So a degreed property would be something that can come in percentages or degrees. It can vary, it can fluctuate. So for example, loudness is a property that can go up or down. Hardness or texture is a property that can fluctuate. But contrast that with a non-degreed property, like the property being even. The number 2 is even and the number 6 is even, but the number 6 is not more even than the number 2. So would you say personhood is a degreed or non-degreed property?
I don't know.
Okay, we don't know. Now, earlier, though, you said that you define personhood as say that again, something about the physical.
I'd say a human being is just the physical body that makes them up. That's
so a person, or you say human being, person, human being, is just the physical body that makes them up. Okay. If you were to chop off my arms and legs, would I be half of a person?
No, as far as I know.
Huh. So apparently it's
Well, if you cut up your brain into parts, you could be partial to a person.
okay. So Dandy Walker syndrome is something. It's a real thing where some people are born with like only 10% of a brain. Are they only 10% people?
No, but I'd say if I cut your corpus callosum in half, you're two people.
Hold on. Okay, so you're not 10%. Okay, so then it seems to me that you would have to concede then that personhood is not a degreed property.
Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
Well, based on the answers you just gave me, you'd have to say no.
Well,
Because
no,
if
not
you're not,
necessarily, because damage to the brain could mean that there's parts of persons, and maybe not. You'd have to have a better understanding of what really makes someone a person, and that we don't have a discrete definition of what that means yet.
okay, no, that's not what I'm saying. If a person born with 10% of a brain is not 10% of a person, and if cutting my arms and legs off don't make me 50% of a person, then it follows that personhood is non-degreed, and then it would also follow from that that personhood must cannot be grounded in just the physical parts of the body that you said that makes a person. So a person can't just be something physical.
No, it's kind of like the species problem in biology. Like you can say, well, is this one of these species or one of these species? Well, we don't know. It's not a hard line distinction between there, even though it is still a gradient.
Right.
Person, and what makes a person is a gradient. We just don't know where exactly the line is. Like, for example, if you're born without a brain, you're not a person because you don't have a brain. You have no consciousness. You have no interaction. You can't live. So you're not a person. At what point do you go from like 10% of a brain, 5%? Where does that line draw? I have no idea. It's still a spectrum. And now whether or not we call it a hard distinction between a person and not person isn't really a solved question. We'd have to know more about the brain before we can answer that.
Okay, so you said there's a gradient. So that means you assume personhood is a degreed property.
No, it could be either way. I don't know.
Because you're giving me two different answers here. The questions I asked, you give me an answer that would lead to this.
Right. I don't have an answer to this because that's purely based on neurology. Once we understand everything about the brain, we can give you a concrete answer and say, yes, personhood is when you have this much level of consciousness, which we qualify as a person. Like, I don't know what the answer to that is, but we
So,
can. What's your question? How does this lead into an argument for the soul?
well, I was getting there, but then you switched your answer up on me, and
I
you
didn't
said,
switch anything. I said I don't know, and then I said it could be this or it could be this. So
well,
that's why I don't know.
I'm in part trying to help you come to a conclusion here because I want to know what you believe because the answers you gave me
Sorry,
would
you're
lead.
not qualified to help me come to a conclusion.
I'm sorry.
You're not qualified to help me come to a conclusion on this.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, I'm doing my best here. Um,
How does this lead to an argument to the soul?
well, because if personhood is not a great property, then you can't base being a person on the physical chemistry and makeup that is what you are, and then it would have to follow that. I'm sorry.
How so? I can just say personhood is a certain level of function of the brain, and once you have this certain level of function, then you're a person. If you don't have this certain level of function, you're not a person. Therefore, it is a physical property.
Okay, no, that wouldn't be. That would just mean that it's a threshold property first. That where you once you reach a certain level, then boom, you're conscious. No, so then, which and it's fair enough. I'll grant that you say you don't know, but is it fair to say that you at least would think that if there was some way to determine personhood, it would be based on functioning?
Yes.
Okay, so if I lose functioning, am I less of a person?
At some point, yes. If you die, you're not a person anymore.
No, I said less of a person.
Zero is less than more. Zero is always less.
Okay, but if I am a person and I lose functioning, am I less of a person?
Right. I would say this goes back to the neurology questions. What do we define as a person? How much function qualifies as a person? Where does the threshold behind it? Is it a spectrum? That's all a neurology question. I can just grant it for the sake of the argument and say personhood is a discrete either yes or no question and say that can still all be explained by the physical. You don't need any supernatural for that at all.
Well, so no, I don't think it can be. So personhood, I would say, is a metaphysical question, not a physical question, because if personhood is non-degreed, which I think you would agree
I'm happy to
to.
grant that for the sake of argument. I
I'm
won't
sorry.
take a stance on it, but
I'm sorry.
I will grant that for the sake of argument, but I don't take a stance on it. It could be either way.
So personhood not a degreed property, then you cannot ground your personhood in anything physical, which means being a person is not necessarily entailed to or tied to something physical. Then you would have to ground it in something transcendent beyond the body that's not physical, namely the soul.
No, I can ground it in the physical processes of the mind. Once it has a certain range of activity, well, then it's personhood. If you have less than that range of activity, it's not a person.
So a person in a coma is not a person.
No, I said a certain range of activity. I don't know what that range of activity is,
Okay,
but I can still ground that in physical processes.
so an arbitrary range of activity, and one thing we didn't get into earlier is now that I remember about going to the pain thing, and we can wrap it up soon if you'd like. Um, are you familiar with inverted qualia?
No.
Okay, so um, it's another way of showing that brain states and mental states are not the same thing. So let's say when I have a sensation of pain, you look in my brain and you see these brain firings. And then let's say you take a sip of lemonade and you get a sensation of bitterness. And when I look in your brain, you have a certain firing. For all I know, it could be the case that when you have a certain brain state, you don't feel what I feel when I have a brain state. Because here's a better example, perhaps.
Right. What you see as red, I can see as blue, and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
For the most, sure, perfect, right. So I think that would pose a huge problem to your AI thing, and I don't know how you would ever be able to tell that what mental state someone's in simply by looking at the brain. And I would argue that is because the mind is not the same thing as a brain.
I just say we don't have absolute knowledge of anything. Like, I can't show that you're conscious, but I still use the same criteria to establish an AI is conscious to the same way I establish you're conscious. So we can determine with some level of certainty that the certain colors we see are the same in some respect. Like, we can show that the eye works and has three types of colors that it can interpret or read. And of those colors, we can show colors that are of the same kind of retina or read by the same part of the retina. We could put them right next to each other to see if you have certain kinds of damage to your eye, which causes you unable to see certain kinds of colors. So we can determine that you do see the same label of what we label as the colors, and that they are the same frequency of light. So we still have a high degree of certainty that this is the color you're seeing, and this is what you see when you see the color. Can we prove it? No, but we don't need to. We can't prove anything in science. It's irrelevant to the question.
How does that make it a high degree of certainty? Because you're pointing at things that are physical, but so consciousness is something that's first person introspective awareness. It's first person private access. You have no access to my mental life. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. But if consciousness is physical, would it not be the case that you should be able to have access to my mental life if consciousness was physical?
No. How would that work?
Because anything physical about me, you have access to as a third party. Yes or no?
No.
Like what?
Like, I can't like analyze every cell and molecule in your body. Like, no, I don't have access to that information.
Sure, you could. In principle, you could. You can get a microscope, and technology can improve. You could, in principle, have access to every physical aspect about me. Right?
Right. Well, it's the same thing with like a CD. You have to have the translation has to be the same language as the CD to get the same information. So even if I had the CD with all of the ones and zeros on it, unless I knew how to read that CD in order to produce the correct song, then I would not have access to the stuff on the CD, even though I had access to everything on the CD.
Because the songs in the CD are not the same thing, right? That's kind
Right,
of
but the song is still physical. It's still a physical thing on the song. You just have to have the right way to read it. So until we have a way to read it, no, I will not have access to what you're experiencing. Now, it is possible that I can do that maybe in the future.
Okay. Okay. So the answer seemed to be that in principle, yes, you can have access to anything physical about me, but you've conceded, or I don't know if you have. Well, let me not say that. Let me be fair here. Well, you did say that you have no access to my conscious life, right?
Right. I can't in any way see what you're seeing.
Okay. And that would that not demonstrate that the physical and the mind are not the same thing?
No. I mean, like you said, we might be able to have that in the future if we discover everything about the brain.
Wait, to have what in the future?
Be able to reproduce conscious experience or see what other people see.
And how would we do? How would we? When I say see, what do you mean by see what other people see? Because in other words, if I'm in pain, or let's say I'm thinking, let's just say I have a thought, right? You see a brain firing in my brain. You can study my brain. Do you know what I'm thinking?
No, that would be like looking at the CD and seeing the bumps on the CD. Like we'd also have to have the translation process of how it goes from the CD to the song.
Okay,
if we had both of those, then yes, I could potentially experience what you're experiencing. Like, I hook that up to my brain somehow.
Right. So as a third party observer, you have access to everything physical about me, but you do not have access to my mental life. The only way you could, how would you have access to my mental life? How could you know anything about me mentally?
Well, if we got to the technological ability where we could dissect every part of the brain and reproduce everything it's doing, then we could also have not only the CD, but also the language the CD is using to translate it into conscious experience. So we could replicate your conscious experience into someone else's brain.
But again, how would you know that's my conscious experience?
We can't.
Inverted qualia. I'm sorry?
We can't know anything with absolute certainty, but we could still know it with the reasonable degree of certainty that science uses to know anything.
Yeah, and I'm not even necessarily talking about certainty here, but in other words, my main point here is, for the sake of time here, is that you have access to all the physical, but not to the mental. And the only way you can have access to my mental life is if I reveal it to you. because consciousness is not physical, while my brain is. In principle, you can have access to every physical thing about me, but you can never have any access to anything mental about me.
Right, and I'm saying that that could be false. We could actually reproduce your conscious experience, or reproduce experience, and replicate it on other people's experience, so they could actually experience everything you experienced.
But Tom, would you not already have to know what my conscious experience was in order to replicate it?
No, we'd only have to know the language. Like, we don't have to know the song on the CD to play the CD and know the song. We just have to know how to read it, how to read the CD, and we put the CD in and it can play the song without us ever knowing what the song is.
I think I see what you're saying, but I think you're missing what I'm saying here. In other words, you could replicate the brain state, but you don't know what mental state I'm in. You don't know what thought I'm thinking just by looking at my brain activity. So you can replicate that brain state in someone else, but you have no idea if what they're thinking is the same thing I'm thinking.
Right, we don't have absolute certainty, but we still have a high degree of certainty.
Now, I would say you have nothing at all when it comes to what I'm thinking. There is no way you can look at my brain and know what I'm thinking. There's no way at all. Absolutely.
You would hold the burden of proof on that one to show that we will never be able to discover a means to do that.
I'm open to even hypotheticals. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll give you any technology you want that you can invent in your mind that you could think could possibly even exist. Give me a way to show that looking at my brain, my neurons firing, will tell you what I'm thinking.
Well, it's the exact same way a computer works. We can look at the ones and zeros and create a screen or whatever is happening on the screen, even though they're two separate kinds of things. We can look at the brain, which is a bunch of ones and zeros firing, essentially, and then produce a different kind of a thing. We just have to find the right language to do it.
Okay, but the thing is, we're talking about replicating my consciousness or my conscious experience.
Right.
And I'm asking, you don't know what my conscious experiences are by looking at my brain. So to replicate whatever's going on in my brain and show it on a screen is to assume that what's on the screen was what I was experiencing, right?
Right.
Okay, but how would you know what I was experiencing?
Well, it's like if I have a camera and it records things and we then play the recording on a TV screen, we have to assume that what's on the TV screen is what the camera was recording.
Yeah.
But
we're talking
we
about
have a high degree of certainty that that's the case, even though we can't prove it.
Again, we've talked about inverted quality already, and we're talking about conscious beings here. Let me put it this way. Because see, and I was kind of, I wasn't necessarily baiting you, but usually what people say to this is they'll say, well, or they'll even ask the question, if I think, will there ever be a time where we can look at the brain and know what a person's thinking or anything like that? I said, well, if that ever did happen, because to an extent we can do something like that. Like we know that when someone's asleep and there's rapid eye movement, are you familiar with what that means?
Yep.
Yeah, so they're dreaming, right? They're in that REM sleep, right? So they're dreaming. You know how we got that information?
How we got the information that people are in rapid eye movement sleep?
Yeah, that they're dreaming.
By watching the rapid eye movement during sleep?
Yeah, but
EEG measurements of the brainwave activity? Like,
that wouldn't tell us that they were dreaming necessarily. That wouldn't, or even so. What they basically did is, and so again, for the sake of time, is they pretty much woke the person up and said, "What's going on? I'm dreaming." Okay, let's try it again. Take a nap. And they stand there with a clipboard. And of course, I'm oversimplifying. So they would basically look at the brain states, ask the person what's going on, and then write it down. So eventually they would kind of start to get at least a beginning of some kind of a mapping. But the point is they could not map that without asking the person, because consciousness is a first person private access kind of thing that is not third party accessible. The only way, if possible, we could ever get to that, it would have to be by looking at the brain states and then asking the person what was going on, because consciousness is not physical. Everything that you have access to as a third-party observer is anything physical, but you have no access to the mental because that is not physical.
well, actually, we could actually verify that, because we could make a prediction and say, if what we're seeing in the brain state is you experiencing this, we will predict that you will say you're experiencing this. Like we can say you're imagining an elephant, and say, are you imagining an elephant? You say yes, and say, well, oh yeah, we can predict from the brain states what you're experiencing.
Only because we had to have the mapping in the first place that I already explained.
Well, no, we can say that we have a prediction. We have a model of how the brain works. We look at the brain states. We make a prediction about what the person is experiencing, and then ask them what they are experiencing. In fact, we've done this test where we've had models of brain states where we say, can we predict what a person is going to choose, option A or option B? And they've predicted it with 80% success, that they can see what you're going to pick like 7 seconds before you pick it. And they can do that just by looking at your brain states.
But no, because any of that information is all a posteriori. It's after the fact. It's after looking at it and after and after asking. You don't just look because you already conceded. You can't just look at my brain and know what I'm thinking.
Well,
You have to
looking at your brain is a posteriori. A priori is just things that we know purely by thinking about them. A posteriori is everything else, everything about the external world.
after the fact. That's literally what it means. After the fact. So it's after the fact of looking at the brain states and asking the person what was going on. You can't. Nobody. And I don't even think anybody believes that you can just look at the brain state because to know how the brain works, I don't even know what you mean by that. I mean, we know that neurons connect and fire and there's synapses, but what does that have to do with knowing how the mind works? A neurosurgeon can know more about my brain than I do, but he cannot know more about my mental life than I do
Well,
because
that's exactly what I'm checking to. We have tests where we can actually say, where the scientist, the neurologist, look at your brain with an fMRI and make predictions about what you're going to do 7 seconds before you do it. So they do know, in these very limited cases, more about your brain than you do.
and right.
Conscious experience than you do.
No, okay, but how did they come to that? It's like saying because these are all
At the brain state, the fMRI. They said we have a pattern in fMRI. This pattern will lead to this action.
How did they know that?
By doing past experiments.
Good, right, and they had to ask the person.
Like all of science, yes. Past experiments that lead to inductive conclusions about future conclusions, yes.
You're missing it. They had to look at the brain state and then ask the person what was going on so they can map that out. Okay, so when you're in brain state X, you are thinking of puppies, let's say. Okay, now I want you to think of unicorns. Okay, that's brain state Y. So that way, the next time they came to somebody and they shocked them to have brain state X, they're going to say, we're going to predict you're going to think about puppies. But that was an a posteriori fact they came to because of the previous experiment, which could have only been done by the person revealing what they were thinking or feeling. Because again, consciousness is a first person private access kind of thing, and everything physical is third party accessible. And that's one of the many reasons to show that consciousness is not physical.
Right, that's how we would verify it, but that doesn't mean that doesn't lead to the conclusion it's not physical. I mean, if we can say we look at a brain state and we make this conclusion of these brain states about what you're feeling, and then we verify that that's correct by asking you personally, that shows that it is actually a brain state. Like, yeah, we can look at brain states and make predictions about what you're thinking without you even knowing it. Like, so the fact that we verify that through means of asking doesn't lend any credence to your conclusion.
Okay, so just we'll leave it at that. I want to ask you a serious question, then and if you don't mind, we can wrap it up. Even though it's like the third thing I said, third time I've said that. What has kept you, or what keeps you from becoming a Christian? And this is, I'm setting philosophical stuff aside, and all things like that.
Problem suffering.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I was a Christian until sometime in late high school.
Reading in the bosom.
Yeah, so then I lost faith because none of my prayers were ever answered, and that really had nothing to do with any of the philosophical arguments or stuff. I didn't get into that until years later. But now, after having researched all of the philosophical arguments, the reason I don't believe in Christianity mostly is the problem of suffering. The idea of an all-good God that created this world is just logically impossible. Along with the fact that there are no good arguments for the existence of God, give me no reasons to believe there is one. But mostly the biggest one is the problem of suffering. It just makes it pretty impossible for a God to exist.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'd like to get some people's opinions on what the best book is on that. And I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd love to buy it for you and send it to you. You can tell me what you think. You don't have to be on here. You can just message me about it. So every time I do things like this or debates or discussions, I always, of course, prepare and pray, but also pray for the people I'm going to be talking with and the people listening. And I say that to say I ask because I've been praying for you. Of course, and for what it's worth, I want to see you in heaven. I'd love to see you back with you and Jesus being, tight and legit. So I appreciate your honesty and transparency in that. And if you don't mind, because and I'm not gonna lie, I got this from Michael Brown. I saw that you allowed him to pray afterwards. Would you mind if I did?
Not at all. Go ahead.
All right. Father, we thank you just for this day and time that you've given us, for allowing me to be able to talk with Tom. I pray that you would speak to him, Holy Spirit, and the ones listening, that you would open their eyes and hearts, Lord, and whatever strongholds or hardened hearts that they may have or feel, Lord, that you would send your spirit and just soften those hearts, Lord, and trade those hearts of stones for hearts of flesh. I pray for Tom and the issues he's working through and with mentally and spiritually, Lord, that you would, as you see fit, Lord, come to him, show him, Lord, instruct him and guide him, Lord, in all his seeking wisdom, Lord, and that he would seek you, or even in times of whatever however you see fit, that he would in some way at least turn his face back to you, Father. We thank you. Again, I thank you for his life and for what he's doing. I thank you for this opportunity you've given us. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks. For some reason, I expect you to say amen when you did that, but you were just, but
Sure, I got a really sore throat, so
no, I'm sorry about that. But hey, thanks for the conversation. I did enjoy it. Hopefully, I wasn't rude or anything like that. If I was, forgive me, pray for me. But no, I enjoyed it.
yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I was probably a little rude. I apologize if I was rude as well, because I'm a little got a cold, so I'm a little irritable. So
No, hey, it's okay. You're determined by the cold, man, to do that. But no, I enjoyed it. And, it's kind of the nature of these things. But I love that. I've seen what you do, and I appreciate the respect and the dialogue. And yeah, it's always good. And of course, for the listeners, there's people who are on the fence on these things and stuff like that. So I enjoy having these discussions.
yeah, me too.
Well, thanks again, even though I've said that twice or three times. But anything else or last thing you want to ask me about or anything like that?
Uh, Actually, there is some more stuff I would like to talk about, but I think we should save that for another conversation.
Yeah, maybe that could happen.
An hour and 40 minutes. So
Yeah, which was cool, and honestly, it flew by fast to me because there was a lot of other stuff. I mean, we barely scratched the surface, of course, but I think it was enough for a good start. And yeah,
oh yeah, I wanted to hear your solution to the
interaction problem.
yeah.
So, okay, well, really quick. So, one, I don't think there's a problem because it's just one of those basic, or what they call would be called a primitive action. It's one of the things that happens because if to ask how that happens, it's like asking how does A cause B. Well, if A just directly and immediately causes B, there's no problem. But if you say, well, A causes B by way of C, then all you have to do is ask, well, how does A interact with C and how does C interact with B? In other words, then you can lead to an infinite regress. So I think the simplest solution, given the arguments for the existence of the soul, which means, just grant me this, if I have good reasons to believe in the soul and arguments to believe in the soul, because when I argue for the soul, I argue 2 points. Consciousness is not physical. And then I argue that consciousness is possessed by something, namely persons, like I possess consciousness. So what is the I, that indexical word? Then I argue that I am not identical to my brain and body. I'm more than a brain and body. And then I argue soul. So given those arguments that I use, if that's the case, then ontologically speaking, the soul exists. And the question of how it interacts with the body is a separate question, independent of the ontological existence of the soul. That's more of an epistemic question. And with that, I'm fine with saying I don't know, but I'm also fine with saying was just a immediate basic action, a primitive action that just it's A directly interacts with B, and there's no intermediate intervening mechanisms that it uses to do that.
I'm not quite sure I follow. Like, if I asked you how does a plane fly, and you said, well, a plane is made of metal, well, that doesn't really tell me anything about how it flies. Because even if you say that it's a basic primitive action, that's a primitive is just a property of the thing. It doesn't explain any mechanistic way it interacts with the physical world. So I don't see how that's a solution to the problem.
So if I said a plane flies by, it has to be an aerodynamic shape and there has to be wind, and okay, but how does that happen? In other words, you can always keep asking hows, right? But at some point, you're going to reach a bedrock.
You have to show that there's some interaction phase. Like, to show a plane flies, it interacts with the air, and the air lifts it off the ground. So you have to show that there's some interaction between this thing and the physical world. So the question is, even if I grant that, like, consciousness or whatever is, or the interaction is itself a primitive or a properly basic kind of thing, how does that get to the physical world?
Yeah, well, again, if we grant, for the sake of argument and time, that consciousness is not physical and that we have souls, then whether or not I can show how it interacts with the body, I don't know. But every time I think, every time I move my fingers and arms, that's my soul interacting with my body. So how? Well, I'd say that the easiest solution, to the simplest thing, would be that it's just an immediate direct action, maybe like a magnet to metal or something. I don't know. But again, I'm fine with saying I don't know, and I'm fine with saying it's one of those immediate basic actions.
I don't see how saying it's immediate basic action solves the problem, because that just goes into a Grippus trilemma. It's either,
well, because it says it's not a problem. Otherwise you lead to an infinite regress. Because take anything, metal and a magnet. Well, how does this happen? By way of this. Okay, well, how does that happen? By way of this. At some point, you're going to reach a point to where you don't, like, if I ask you, how did you get here? Well, I came in my car. How'd you come in your car? Well, I turned on the engine. How'd you turn on the engine? I put the key in the ignition. How'd you put the key in the ignition? Like that. Well, how did you know it? So it's one of those, like I said, that's why it's called a basic action. So.
well, I mean, I agree with you, but when I ask, like, how does a plane fly, and you say, well, it lifts up, it interacts with the air, causes it to lift up. Like I'm satisfied with that. I wouldn't need to ask, like, keep asking why at that point. But you need to apply some kind of interaction between the two to actually solve the interaction problem. So I don't see how saying it's a properly basic thing actually solves the problem. Like I don't think that would get past.
Every interaction have an intermediate interaction?
No, I don't. I wouldn't grant that. I would say that we can just let's just grant that it's like a first mover kind of a interaction.
Okay.
You still have to say how does that first mover interaction interact with the physical world? Like,
Yeah, and that's fair, and you know, you could say, okay, so you have a name for it, but that's not an explanation, and I'd be okay with, you know, if you accuse me of that, but I'd go back to maybe we'll know in the future, maybe this or that, I don't know, but I again, in other words, I'm satisfied with that. Obviously, you're not satisfied with it, which is fine. But given the more important ontological question of whether or not this exists, I say once that's answered, everything else is kind of a secondary issue or question.
yeah, I grant that. If you could actually show that the soul does exist and there was a second area of existing kind of ontological stuff, then that would be sufficient for me.
Right on. Yeah. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed our conversation. Hope to talk with you again sometime soon.
Yeah. Likewise. Talk to you
See
later.